The structure rising from the Utah soil in the autumn of 1879 looked less like a house and more like something grown. It had no clean-edged logs, no proud dovetail joints. Instead, a 4-foot-high base of gray riverstone gave way to 22 inches of thick, curving walls made of mud and straw. To the settlers of Cache Valley, men and women who staked their lives on the predictable strength of timber, it was a profound and unsettling sight. This was a house made of the ground itself, shaped by hand like a colossal piece of pottery. The valley's master builder, a man whose name was synonymous with sound construction, was Brigham Tolliver. He had built the meeting house, the grist mill, and 24 of the tightest, truest log homes in the settlement. He stood one afternoon, arms crossed, watching the Slovak immigrant Stefan slapping another handful of wet cob onto the rising wall. Tolliver's assessment was professional, public, and absolute. He said it would slump. He said the first spring thaw would turn the clay to slurry, spilling it off the stone plinth like melting butter. He staked his reputation on the fact that it would never, under any circumstances, carry the load of a snow-covered roof through a Wasatch winter. Yet when that winter came, and a brutal inversion freeze locked the valley at 22 degrees below zero for 10 straight days, every log home, including Tolliver's own, wept with interior frost and devoured firewood by the cord. The Hrebic cabin, the strange mud and stone folly on the south-facing slope, consumed almost none. It sat in the frozen landscape, a faint curl of smoke from its chimney the only sign of life, holding a quiet, impossible warmth within its earthen walls. The question hung in the frigid, still air of the valley, unspoken, but felt by every shivering family. How could a house with no logs, a house made of dirt, outlast a house made of wood? If you stay with this story, I promise you will understand the elegant physics of thermal mass coupling, a principle that allowed a humble structure to store the very heat of the sun. You will see how knowledge carried across an ocean in the mind of a single man could overturn generations of frontier convention. If you find value in these stories of quiet ingenuity, consider subscribing to our channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. Stefan Hrebic was not a farmer. He had none of a farmer's ingrained knowledge of soil types or planting seasons. He was not a logger or a carpenter. The heft of an axe felt foreign in his hands, and the language of board feet and timber framing was a dialect he did not speak. Stefan was a pechnik, a hearth mason, from the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His entire life before crossing the Atlantic had been defined by the interplay of fire, stone, and clay. His hands knew the precise texture of fire brick that could withstand 1,000 heat cycles, the gritty feel of refractory mortar, the heft of soot-blackened trowels, and the subtle art of shaping a flue to maximize draft while minimizing heat loss. He had spent his youth and young adulthood building the monumental masonry heaters, the Kachlova Pek, that formed the warm heart of every Slovak home. These were not mere fireplaces. They were massive, intricate structures of brick, tile, and clay, designed to absorb the intense energy of a short, hot fire and then radiate gentle, steady warmth for 24 hours. His apprenticeship was not about building walls to keep the cold out. It was about building a core that held the heat in. This was the fundamental difference in his thinking, a difference no one in Cache Valley could yet comprehend. He and his wife, Anka, had arrived in Utah 2 years prior, drawn by pamphlets promising fertile land and a community of the faithful. They bought their small parcel on a gentle slope with a good southern exposure, a decision guided by an instinct Stefan couldn't yet articulate into the language of construction. Their first cabin was built in a hurry, with purchase planks and the help of their new neighbors. It was a conventional structure, a simple box against the wilderness, and it had nearly broken them. That first winter of 1878 was a lesson in the brutal physics of cold. Stefan remembered it not in days or weeks, but in a series of sharp, sensory snapshots. He remembered the seams of the plank walls, which by supper time would be traced with delicate, knife-edged lines of interior frost. He remembered the iron pump handle outside, how it had once seized the wet skin of his palm, leaving a patch of raw, bleeding flesh. He remembered the tin of coffee grounds on a shelf near the wall, opening it one morning to find the contents frozen into a solid, useless disk. Anka had developed a persistent, rattling cough that lasted until the spring thaw. Their meager woodpile vanished at an alarming rate, the small stove glowing red-hot in a desperate, losing battle against the encroaching cold. The heat it produced was aggressive and temporary. It rose to the ceiling, leaving their feet numb, and as soon as the fire died down, a deep, penetrating chill would reclaim the room within an hour. They slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. Stefan spent that long, miserable winter observing. He saw that the log cabins of his neighbors, even the masterfully built homes of Brigham Tolliver, suffered the same fundamental problem, only to a lesser degree. They were better sealed, their logs thicker, but they were still shells. They were barriers, and a barrier can only slow the passage of heat. It cannot hold it. He watched the sun, a pale, low disk in the winter sky. He saw how it struck the south-facing walls of the cabins and the dark stones of the hillsides. The wooden walls remained frigid to the touch, reflecting most of the light. But the dark stones, even on the coldest days, would feel marginally less brutal, holding a ghost of the sun's energy. It was in those observations that the memory of his trade reawakened. He wasn't in the Carpathians, but the principles of heat, mass, and time were the same. The problem wasn't the cold, it was the house. The house was a sieve. He needed to build not a barrier, but a vessel. The failure of a conventional frontier cabin in a place like Cache Valley was not a failure of craftsmanship. Brigham Tolliver was a master of his craft. His dovetail joints were so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade into them. His chinking, a mixture of clay, sand, and buffalo grass, was applied with a practiced hand. The failure was not in the execution. It was in the core philosophy of the design itself. A log cabin is fundamentally a thermal resistor. Its job is to slow down the rate at which heat escapes. But in the face of a relentless minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, slowing it down wasn't enough. The primary enemy was low thermal mass. A log, for all its thickness, is mostly trapped air and cellulose. It heats up quickly, and it cools down just as fast. A standard 8-inch thick pine log has an R value of about 10, a decent insulator, but it has very little capacity to store heat energy. As soon as the stove inside the cabin stopped pumping out BTUS, the logs themselves would begin to cool, their interior surfaces quickly dropping to a temperature that felt cold to the touch. They became radiators of cold, vast surfaces, pulling warmth from any object or person in the room. The second enemy was thermal bridging and air infiltration. Every joint, every seam between the logs was a potential pathway for cold air to enter and warm air to escape. As the green logs dried and shrank over their first few seasons, these gaps would widen, chinking would crack and pull away. Tolliver's methods were the best in the valley, but even he was fighting a losing battle against the natural movement of wood. Families would spend their autumns meticulously re-chinking their homes, only to find new hair-thin cracks appearing by January, each one a tiny, persistent river of frigid air. You could trace these leaks on a windy day by holding a candle near the walls and watching the flame dance and flicker. Condensation was the third and perhaps most insidious problem. The warm, moist air inside the cabin, from breathing, cooking, and boiling water for laundry, would travel towards the cold outer walls. When it hit a surface below its dew point, it would condense into water or, in the depths of winter, into frost. This frost would build up along the bottom of the walls, at the nail heads, and in the corners. It made the cabin feel damp and clammy, even with a fire roaring. It soaked into the chinking, which would then freeze solid, expand, and crack further. It rotted the logs from the inside out and fostered mildew. The very act of living inside the house created the moisture that was helping to destroy it. Stefan saw all of this in his neighbors' homes. He would visit the Larson family and see Mrs. Larson constantly wiping down the window panes where frost bloomed in thick, fern-like patterns. He would talk with old Jedediah Smith, who complained that his joints ached from the drafts he couldn't find, a cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his well-built home. They were all trapped in the same cycle: burn more wood, create more heat, which would then find its way out through the 1,000 tiny leaks in the shell of the house, pulling in more cold air to replace it. They were trying to heat the entire state of Utah, one armload of firewood at a time. Stefan knew that the solution wasn't a bigger fire. The solution was a different kind of wall, a wall that could hold the day. The work began in the late summer of 1879, as soon as the last of the hay was cut and stored. Stefan Hrebick did not start by felling trees. He started by walking the creek bed that bordered his property, his eyes scanning not for timber, but for stone. He selected dozens of smooth, rounded granite stones, from the size of a loaf of bread to the size of a small hog, and began hauling them to the building site on a simple stone boat pulled by his lone ox. This was work the valley understood. Many homes had stone foundations, or chimneys. For weeks, his labor was unremarkable. He laid out the footprint of the small, rectangular house, orienting its longest side to face due south. Then, with mortar mixed from local clay and sand, he began to build the plinth. It rose steadily, a marvel of careful masonry. He wasn't just stacking rocks, he was fitting them together, finding the natural contours where one stone would nestle against another, creating a solid 4-foot-high wall of immense weight and density. The neighbors who passed by would nod in approval. A man who knew stone was a respectable thing. Brigham Tolliver himself rode by once, surveyed the clean lines and tight mortar joints of the plinth, and gave a curt professional nod. The foundation was sound. Then came the part that baffled everyone. Once the stone plinth was complete, Stefan stopped hauling stone and started digging a pit. He, Anka, and a hired boy began excavating clay from a deposit he'd found 50 yards from the house. They piled it near the foundation. They brought in sand from the creek bed and straw from the threshing floor. They added water and began to mix. This was the signature moment of the construction, the point at which curiosity turned to skepticism and then to outright mockery. The mixing was done not with shovels, but with feet. Stefan, Anka, and the boy would roll up their trousers, step into the muddy pit, and begin to tread, their feet working the straw and sand into the clay. A slow, rhythmic, primal process. The resulting material was cob, a sticky, fibrous, heavy mud. He would scoop up great armfuls of it, carry it to the stone plinth, and begin to build the walls. There were no forms, no frames. He simply plopped a mass of cob onto the stone, and then, using his bare hands, he pressed and sculpted it into place, patting and smoothing the sides, building up the wall in a thick layer, or lift, about 2 feet high. His hands, the same hands that knew the precise feel of fire brick, now moved with a strange, intimate knowledge of the mud. He worked it, compressed it, felt for air pockets, ensuring the bond with the layer below was complete. It was during the shaping of the second lift that Brigham Tolliver made his formal visit. He dismounted from his horse, his boots making crisp sounds on the dry autumn grass. He walked the perimeter of the structure, his gaze critical and intense. He ran a hand over the rough, drying surface of the first cob lift. He looked at the massive 22-inch thickness of the wall. He looked at Stefan, his hands and forearms caked in drying mud. "Refuge," Tolliver began, his voice not unkind, but heavy with the authority of a man who had built this valley. "That foundation is as fine as any I've seen, but this—" He gestured to the mud wall. "This is a mistake. I've seen adobe fail in this climate. This cob is no different. The first spring thaw, when the snow melts and the ground heaves, moisture will get between your stone and your clay. It will turn this bottom layer to mush. The whole thing will slump outwards." He paused, letting the weight of his experience settle. "And if it doesn't slump, the roof load will pancake it. A wall needs timber to carry weight. This is just dirt. It won't hold." Stefan wiped his hands on a piece of burlap. He looked at Tolliver, then at his wall, then back to Tolliver. His English was still thick with the accent of his homeland. "In my country," he said simply, "we build this way for 500 years. The stone is for the wet. The clay is for the cold." He then turned, picked up another mass of cob, and slapped it onto the wall, returning to his work. The conversation was over. The work continued through September and October, a race against the coming winter. The walls rose slowly, each lift needing days to dry enough to support the next. The deep-set window frames for the south-facing wall were put in place, looking like dark, empty eyes in the pale brown walls. Finally, with the walls complete, he laid a massive timber plate along the top and, with the help of a few neighbors paid for their time, raised the log rafters for the roof. Seeing timber finally incorporated seemed to reassure some, but to Tolliver it only increased the danger. A heavy roof on weak walls was a recipe for collapse. As the first snowflakes of November began to fall, Stefan Refuge was plastering the exterior of his house with a final coat of lime wash, a stark white skin over the earthen walls. The house was finished. It stood on the hillside, unlike anything else for 100 miles, waiting for the judgment of a Wasatch winter. To understand why Stefan Refuge's house worked, you have to understand a principle that goes beyond simple insulation. The house was not just a barrier, it was a battery. It was a system designed to capture, store, and slowly release thermal energy. The science behind it is called thermal mass coupling. Let's break it down. First, thermal mass. This is an object's ability to store heat. Think of a blacksmith's forge. A thin piece of sheet metal placed in the fire will glow red hot in seconds, and when removed, it will cool to the touch in less than a minute. It has low thermal mass. A thick block of stone or iron, however, will take a long time to heat up. But once it is hot, it will remain warm for hours after the fire is gone, radiating a gentle, steady heat. It has high thermal mass. The log walls of a conventional cabin have very low thermal mass. They are insulators, not storage vessels. The 22-inch thick cob walls of Refuge's house, a dense mixture of clay and sand, were the opposite. They weighed over 120 pounds per cubic foot. The entire structure contained tens of thousands of pounds of sheer, dense mass. But mass alone isn't enough. You need a way to charge the battery. This is where the second part of the system comes in: passive solar gain. Refuge had instinctively oriented his house to the south and installed large, deep-set windows on that wall. In the winter, the sun hangs low in the southern sky. Its rays travel at a low angle, penetrating deep into a south-facing house. From morning until late afternoon, direct sunlight poured through those windows, striking the interior stone and cob walls and the dark stone floor. Every square foot of sunlit surface was absorbing energy, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs. A typical square foot of window can let in over 250 BTUs per hour on a clear winter day. Over the course of the day, Rebek's south-facing windows were pouring tens of thousands of BTUs of free energy directly into the thermal mass of the house. The stone plinth and the thick cob walls soaked it up like a sponge. This is where the final, crucial piece, the coupling, happens. The stone plinth, being darker and denser, would heat up most efficiently during the day. As evening fell and the temperature outside plummeted, the flow of energy would reverse. The heat stored in the stone and cob would begin to radiate slowly back into the living space. The key was the 22-inch thickness of the cob walls. Clay is a relatively poor conductor of heat. This was a benefit, not a drawback. It meant the heat didn't escape quickly to the outside. Instead, it moved slowly inward, creating a time lag. The peak of the sun's heat hitting the exterior of the south wall at noon wouldn't be felt on the interior surface until 8 or 10 hours later, precisely when it was needed most, in the middle of the cold night. Tolliver was right about one thing. Cob is not a great insulator in the modern sense of R value. But he was thinking about heat loss in only one direction, from inside to out. He failed to account for the massive energy gain from the sun. Rebek's house worked because the solar gain during the day far exceeded the heat loss through the walls at night. The house maintained a stable, comfortable temperature, not by resisting the cold, but by absorbing and releasing the warmth of the day before. It was a living, breathing system, inhaling sunlight and exhaling warmth. That winter, the cold came and did not leave. It began in the second week of January with a slate-gray sky that seemed to press down on the valley, trapping the cold air beneath a lid of warmer air above. It was a classic Wasatch inversion. There was no wind, no dramatic blizzard, just a silent, relentless, and deepening cold. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero, then 15. Then for 10 consecutive days, it did not rise above 22 degrees below zero even at midday. For the families in their log cabins, life became a grim battle of attrition. The world shrank to the small circle of warmth around the stove. Every piece of iron in the house was a conduit for the cold. Axe heads, nails, and door latches felt dangerously frigid, capable of burning the skin. Water buckets left a foot from the fire would develop a skin of ice. The constant ravenous hunger of the stoves was the defining rhythm of their days. Men and older boys spent their waking hours felling, bucking, and splitting wood, their breath freezing in their beards. The woodpile, which had seemed so immense in October, now looked terrifyingly small. Inside the cabins, the air was thick with wood smoke and the damp chill of condensation. Frost crept up the inside of the walls, thickest near the floor, a visible measure of their losing fight. Brigham Tolliver's own home, the finest in the valley, was no exception. He fed his large cast-iron stove constantly, yet his wife still wore 2 shawls indoors, and they moved their bed into the main room, as close to the fire as possible. The cold was a physical presence, an enemy that had breached the walls and laid siege to the hearth itself. At the Rebek cabin, life continued with a strange, quiet normalcy. The small masonry heater Stefan had built in the center of the home was fired only twice a day. In the morning, he would load it with a small armful of wood and let it burn hot and fast for about an hour. He would do the same in the evening. For the rest of the day and through the night, the massive brick and clay structure would radiate a gentle, pervasive warmth. There were no hot spots and no cold drafts. The numerical contrast was stark. Outside, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Stefan's home, the temperature hovered around a steady 65 degrees Fahrenheit. But the true difference was told in the small details of domestic life. Anka did her mending in the afternoon by the south-facing window, not for the light, but for the palpable warmth coming off the sun-drenched wall. A bucket of water left on the floor 10 feet from the stove remained liquid. There was no frost on the walls, not even in the corners. The air was dry and still. They were not surviving the winter. They were living in it, comfortably. Neighbors who had to make a rare trip past their homestead would see the thin, lazy curl of smoke from the chimney and shake their heads. It didn't make sense. A fire that small couldn't possibly fight a cold this big. They assumed the Slovaks were either freezing or possessed some secret, foreign magic. The truth was simply physics, but a physics they had never been taught. The breaking point of the cold snap came on its 10th day. The sky remained a flat, oppressive gray, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Brigham Tolliver and his 17-year-old apprentice, a lanky boy named Jesse, were attempting to reinforce the roof of a new barn that was groaning under a heavy load of wind-drifted snow. Their movements were stiff, their tools uncooperative. Metal was brittle in the intense cold. The accident was small and swift. Jesse, his hands clumsy in thick mittens, lost his grip on a heavy chisel. It slid down the icy roof plank, and the frozen, razor-sharp edge sliced through his mitten and across the back of his hand. He cried out, a sharp sound in the still air. When he pulled the mitten off, blood welled up, dark and thick in the cold, and then began to freeze almost instantly. Tolliver knew the danger. In this cold, a man could lose a hand to frostbite in minutes, especially with a wound. Their own cabin was a mile away. Too far. The nearest shelter was 50 yards up the slope, Hrebek's mud house. Swallowing his pride, Tolliver half-carried, half-dragged the pale and shivering apprentice towards the strange white structure. He pounded on the heavy wooden door. When Stefan Hrebek opened it, a wave of impossible warmth washed over them. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a soft, enveloping warmth, like a summer evening. They stumbled inside, blinking in the steady, calm light. Anka Hrebek took one look at Jesse's hand and immediately went to work, her movements calm and efficient. She had him sit, gently washed the wound with warm water, and began to bandage it with clean linen. Stefan offered Tolliver a seat, but the master builder was too agitated, too disoriented by the environment. He paced the small room, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him. The air was warm. The floor was not cold. The walls felt alive. He stopped his pacing and leaned his shoulder against the thick south-facing wall, expecting the familiar, draining chill of an exterior wall in January. His certainty was absolute. A wall, in winter, is a cold sink. It pulls heat from your body. But this wall did not. Instead, he felt a gentle, persistent warmth pushing back through his thick wool coat. It was a sensation so profoundly wrong, so contrary to a lifetime of experience, that he froze. The sun had set nearly 2 hours ago, yet the wall was still breathing the memory of its light into the room. He pressed his bare palm flat against the clay plaster. It was unmistakably warm, not hot, just alive with stored energy. In that moment, Brigham Tolliver's entire understanding of shelter, an understanding built over 30 years and 100 buildings, was shattered by the simple, undeniable evidence of his own skin. He saw Anka finishing the bandage. He needed to make a note, a reminder to bring the boy back to have the dressing checked. He reached into his inner coat pocket for his notebook and the small pencil stub he always carried. Inside the impossible warmth of the cabin, he scribbled a quick note. The graphite was soft, leaving a clean, dark line on the page. Later, as he and the bandaged apprentice stepped back out into the brutal, soul-crushing cold, Tolliver had another thought. He reached into his outer coat pocket for a different pencil he kept there for marking timber. He tried to write a note on a wood chip. The moment the lead touched the surface, it snapped. a tiny, sharp crack in the frozen silence. The lead inside his pocket, exposed to the ambient air, had become as brittle as glass. The lead from inside the cabin, protected by Hrebek's wall, was still pliable. It was a small thing, a snapped pencil lead, but it was the final perfect piece of proof. Tolliver looked from the broken pencil in his hand to the strange white house on the hill. Hrebek hadn't just built a cabin. Tolliver understood now. He had built a reservoir for daylight. The story of the apprentice's hand and the warm mud wall spread through Cache Valley with the speed of a spring thaw. It was one thing to hear rumors of the Slovak's comfort. It was another to have it verified by Brigham Tolliver himself. Tolliver, a man of few words and immense professional pride, did not make grand pronouncements, but when asked he would simply say, "The house holds the sun. Go feel the wall after dark." His quiet admission carried more weight than 100 sermons. The true vector of the innovation's spread, however, was a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne was the foreman of the valley's main threshing crew, a practical, observant man who spent every autumn moving from one farm to another, a journey that took him inside nearly every barn and home in the region. And yet he had heard the stories about Hrebek's cabin, and, being a man who trusted his own eyes, he paid a visit the following March. He spent an evening there, felt the warmth of the walls, and understood the simple, powerful logic of the design. Thorne was not a builder, but he was a keen record keeper. On the back of his tally board, where he tracked bushels of wheat and oats for each farm, he sketched the essential elements of Hrebek's design: a cross-section showing the 4-foot stone plinth, the thick cob wall rising from it, and arrows indicating the low angle of the winter sun pouring through a south-facing window. As he made his rounds that fall of 1880, he talked about it. To the Peterson family, who had lost a child to pneumonia the winter before, he didn't talk about physics. He talked about a house without drafts. To the German-speaking Schmidt family, struggling with a dwindling wood supply, he didn't talk about thermal mass. He sketched the small masonry stove and explained how it burned half the fuel for twice the heat. At each of the 14 farms his crew worked, he would pull out his tally board and show the drawing. "The Slovak is onto something," he'd say. "Stone to keep the feet dry, mud to hold the sun." By the spring of 1881, the idea had taken root. 3 families, including the Petersons, began digging foundations for their own cob-on-stone homes. They consulted with Stefan Hrebek, who shared his knowledge freely, showing them how to test the clay, how to get the right mix of straw, how to shape the walls. Brigham Tolliver, in a quiet act of professional humility, even offered to help frame their roofs, ensuring they were seated correctly on the new earthen walls he had once condemned. The landscape of the valley was beginning to change, one warm, mud-walled house at a time. The principles Stefan Hrebek applied with mud and stone are now at the heart of modern sustainable building and passive solar design. His hand-shaped cob walls are the ancestors of today's rammed earth construction and insulated concrete forms. His understanding of thermal mass coupling is the same principle behind a tram wall, a sophisticated solar heat collector used in modern energy-efficient homes. What he knew through tradition and observation, we now model with complex software and measure with precise instruments. But the core idea remains unchanged. A building can be more than a static shield against the elements. It can be a dynamic system that interacts with its environment, harvesting and storing the natural energy of its surroundings. There is a profound lesson in the walls of that simple house. In a world that often values speed and convention, Stefan Hrebek chose a path that was slow, laborious, and radically different. He did not seek to overpower the winter with a larger fire. He sought to cooperate with the sun. His home was a testament to the idea that true resilience often comes not from brute force, but from intelligent design and a deep understanding of natural cycles. The sun set hours ago, his neighbors would note, seeing no roaring fire, yet the wall of his house had not finished giving back the day. It was a structure built not just of clay and stone, but of patience and memory, holding the warmth of the light long after the world had gone dark. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you believe this kind of practical wisdom deserves to be remembered, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity. Let us know in the comments what modern building techniques this story brings to your mind. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply these or similar methods should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.